Oh, I think, okay, good, great, thanks. You all probably received a paper when you came in. I know there was, if you don't have a pen or pencil or whatever, I understand. But that's something, if you want to, you could go through and check through it. We're going to be covering a lot of ground, and you can see that by the paper, but we're going to cover several fields, actually. We'll get into history, archaeology, creation science, and as Clint, right? Clint, he was saying that a lot of it is what's geological, and so I hope you have a chance to, if you haven't already looked, or look again at the back of what we have there. We call our little mini museum, and Clint was talking about his garage. He should see our garage up in Illinois, because we are collectors, and God has blessed us to go several places. We've been on 2 different dinosaur digs and a fish fossil dig in Kansas and different things. So there's a lot of things that we have, and so that's just a real sample. But I hope that you will be able to go back and look at that, and we'll try to get back there and answer any questions you might have with that. So I asked Pastor if this would be okay, because sometimes my wife and I do we call it a tag team. She's really more the scientist. I'm more Bible and history and archaeology. And so we're going to go back and forth a little bit. I'll start it off and turn it over to her, and then it'll come back to me. So hopefully you'll fasten your seatbelts, because there's a lot of information that'll be covered here. So idea, of course, is to whet your appetite. Some of you have a familiarity with this. Some of you don't. So I hope that this will be a blessing and encouragement to you as we serve a mighty God. And if you think about the evidence of, one of the things, of course, we like to cover is the evidence of the worldwide flood. And that is all over the place, and we've been several places to discover those things. So that's some of the things that we're going to really key in on. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's see the first slide. It's called Discovering the Proper Perspective. And so we're going to see 2 different things. We're going to see the evolutionary perspective, and then we're going to see the Bible, or the biblical perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to my wife first, and she's going to talk about the perspectives.
I've got it.
You got it.
Yep, but you can have that. All right, so we're going to start off with the perspectives. Somebody raise your hand and tell me, what do you see up there? What do you see? A hummingbird. Are you sure you see a hummingbird? Everybody nod your head. Do you see a hummingbird? Everyone's sure. Okay, Brian, next. Now, actually, it's a rabbit. That's what we mean by perspective. It's how you look at something. Now, that's the same piece of paper. All right, good. You know what? I think I can do them. It's the bottom one, right? Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, so it's the same piece of paper. It depends on how you turn it and how you look at it as to what you see. And that's how it is with all of the fossils and really all of science. There's 2 perspectives of how to look at something. You can look at from the secular viewpoint that says there is no God and everything happened by chance. Or you can look at it from the biblical viewpoint. There is a God, and God created everything. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to look at both perspectives. But how would you know what this really is, whether it's a hummingbird or whether it's a rabbit? There's only one way you could know for sure. Yeah? It looks like it, but there's still only one way you can know for sure. Well, no, there's no bone structure on that piece of paper. There's no DNA on that piece of paper. I'm going to give you a hint in a minute. Well, for creation, yes, but I'm talking about, is this a hummingbird or a rabbit? How would you know? Yes, ask the one who cut it out. Okay, which happened to be me, and I love birds. It's a hummingbird. All right. Next one. I think. Right, there we go. All right, so we're going to start with Darwin. Notice what you see on here with Darwin's tree of life. Darwin did not come up with evolution. He made it popular. He took some stuff. Greeks way back all believed in evolution. But he's the one who really made it popular, and everybody jumped on it and said, oh, yes. But how did he start this page of notes where he was writing out his little tree of life? What did he put up there? I think it was just an idea. He had no proof. He had no evidence. It was just an idea. And it still is. Right, next one. This wasn't working so well with the clicker. There we go. But if Darwin had the microscopes that we have today, and if Darwin saw inside of a cell and how complicated that cell really is, I don't think Darwin would have come up with his little theory, because a cell is extremely complicated, and there's no way that it could just, all those pieces form and come together together and all work properly. But in the nucleus, that's the biggest thing. Who knows what's in the nucleus of a cell? The DNA, the instructions on how to make everything, right? We don't get computer code unless there's somebody who wrote the code, right? And we don't get DNA unless somebody wrote it, right? Next one. Set that down. All right, but here's the other big one. And this is in every single science book. You can look it up in the back, the law of biogenesis, and it will tell you the page. Biogenesis means where did life come from? And the law of biogenesis says that all life had to come from pre-existing life. They cannot make life in a laboratory. It has to come from pre-existing life. Louis Pasteur discovered that law. He discovered even things as simple as bacteria has to come from other bacteria. It can't just form all by itself. Who knows the opposite of the law of biogenesis? If something could just spring up all by itself, does anybody know what that would be called? It would be evolution. It would be the base of evolution, but there's another word for it. Yeah, that's all the planets. Spontaneous generation. Has anybody heard of that one? All right, spontaneous means it just happens all by itself, and generation is where it came from. All right, next one. Now, the secular perspective is that one organism will slowly change into another given enough time. Time is the magic wand for evolution. They said we just have to give it a few more billions of years, and of course anything could happen, right? Next one, but let's see what we see in nature. This is amber. Amber comes from tree resin that turns into like a hard plastic. So we find it as fossils. We find all kinds of creatures trapped in this resin that we call amber. Do they look the same as what we have today? Or are these really weird creatures that you've never seen before? They look the same, but yet scientists say they are 50 million years old. And they say that because of how deep you find it in the geological column. Basically, the deeper you go, the older it gets, is what they say. But if evolution were true, in 50 million years, things should have changed. We shouldn't have the same things alive today that we see in the fossils. Next one. This is a horseshoe crab. And the horseshoe crab, you find it at the lowest level of the fossils. So that's why they give the long age of 450 million years old. Yet we still find them on the beach today. Exactly the same. Now, David Reeves has got a cool museum called the Wonder Center. Who's been to it? It's real close. All right, very good. Over in his fossil cases, he's got a great fossil of a horseshoe crab and then a dead horseshoe crab. All right, so you can see that really well. All right, so if evolution were true, we shouldn't have the same crabs today that you find in the fossil record. Next one. Crinoids are my favorite. Crinoids are all through Tennessee. Y'all should have all found crinoids, probably even in your backyard, or at least in the roadside cuts. Crinoids are sea lilies. They're creatures that live on the bottom of the ocean, and they look like a flower. But we find them everywhere, all over the world. And you find them in every level, all the way at the bottom, all the way up through the top. So they're scattered throughout the geological column, and they haven't changed. So again, if evolution were possible, what we see in the lowest level of the geological column should not be on the earth today. Right, next one. Now, the secular perspective is that fossils formed when organisms were slowly buried. You see that geological column? They say the layers were laid slowly, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And that's where they get their millions of years. So they say that something died and it was slowly buried, and then it slowly turned into a fossil. Right? Next one. But here we find an octopus. Now, I could see a bone turning into stone, but an octopus, this is just muscle. This is just no bones there. So for an octopus to turn into a fossil, could it have been slowly buried over a long period of time? No, it would have rotted away, right? You have to bury it fast and quick under a whole lot of sediment to preserve that. And this was so well preserved. They took the dried up ink from the ink pouch, mixed it with water, and drew that top picture. So even the ink had not disintegrated. All right, next one. But this is even more amazing. These were jellyfish that turned into fossils. So that's the one thing. Jellyfish, they turn into jelly and melt away on the beach pretty quick, right? But they found them in Wisconsin. What in the world are jellyfish doing in Wisconsin? Okay, so they've got two problems there. So they were buried quickly and deeply, but then also sea creatures and jellyfish and whatnot, you can find them all over the world because at one time the whole world was covered by water. All right, next one. I jumped ahead into Brian's part. All right, Fossil Butte. Fossil Butte is one of my favorite places to go. Because if you want to find fish fossils, everybody gets to find them, right? But you go up the whole mountain. Let's go ahead and look at the next one so we can see the mountain. You go up that whole mountain and all of those layers you see, and you find nothing, 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 till you get up there towards the top. And there's 18 inches, and that's where all the fish fossils are. Now, if these layers were laid slowly over millions of years while life was on Earth, you should find fossils in all the layers, right? But you only find them right there at the top. And you find them perfectly preserved. Now, who can tell me what happens to a dead fish? Well, yes, give me one thing. They died. And when they die, what's going to happen to that fish? Yes. Not usually. Well, in the back, yes. They rot away. Within 2 weeks, usually they rot and they turn to naught. What else happens to a dead fish, though? Before they rot, they float. Very good. They float. They bloat and they float. What else happens to a dead fish? They turn upside down and they float. And there's another fish in the water and they're going to eat it. All right, next picture. Do you see any bite marks? Has it started to fall apart yet? Has it started to rot? No. These fish were buried very, very quickly in a lot of mud, not slowly, one little bit of mud at a time. Right? Next one, but this is how you find them. Isn't that amazing? We have a few at the back table that you can see. And the one back there that's leaning against the wall, if you pick it up and turn it over, there's the head of a big fish on the other side. So these fish fossils, they're all squished together, layer upon layer. Very, very quickly formed. All right, next one. But this is a lemur. They find horses and alligators and lemurs and just all kinds of critters mixed in with these fish. Right now today, where do lemurs live? Madagascar, and that's it, except for a zoo. But yet we can find their fossils all over the place. All right, next one. There's a palm tree, right? Palm trees do not grow in Wyoming. Palm trees, I don't even think grow here in Tennessee. No, it's too cold, all right? But at some point in time, palm trees grew all over the place, or they floated there. Next one. Right, dinosaurs. The secular perspective is that dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, long before people were even on the scene. Now, we can't talk long about dinosaurs, but we have a whole presentation just on that. Next one. We will cover a couple of things. One is where the name came from. Dinosaur means giant lizard. If you're talking Latin, you'd say dinosaur. So Sir Richard Owen was putting the bones into the museum, and he had to name everything, and so he said, this is a terrible lizard. And he spoke Latin, so he came up with the word dinosaur. Notice the date. When was the word invented? 1841. If you had a history book from the 1600s, could you find the word dinosaur in it? No. Next picture. You would find the word dragon. Dragon is what they used to be called. The living creature was called a dragon. Their fossils were called dinosaurs. Sir Richard Owen actually went back and forth and called them both. But dinosaur was the new scientific term. Next one. Marco Polo wrote about dragons in his book of China. He went and explored all over China. He came back and he wrote a book about it. Some were like pets, some were work dinosaurs like the picture. Some were mean dinosaurs off in the caves, and you left them alone, right? But he described them so well that you would say, oh, I know what that one is, right? Next one. Now today, we have a myth of a dragon, and they all have wings, and they, be careful with this because the satanic stuff is also sometimes wrapped up in the dragon world, all right? So you got to be careful when you get into studying about dragons. But if you look at the picture on this side where you have the long neck and then you have the pterodactyl, both were living creatures. There's legends and stories about both. But over time, as the stories were passed down, once the animals were dead and gone, they kind of got blended. Can you see that? To where after a while, every time you talk about a dragon, you put wings on them, okay? Even though dinosaurs didn't have wings. They didn't turn into birds either. Next one. All right. Now, this is a dinosaur dig that we went on in South Dakota. And you went through the field till you came to the edge of the cliff, and then we hiked down the edge of the cliff till we got to the lair where they found the dinosaur. And everybody just kind of spread out along the trail, knelt in the dirt, and started digging in front of you and dug out whatever bones you had right there. So, but what did it take to turn that bone into stone, right? Could a dinosaur just lay there and slowly get covered over a long period of time? What would happen to them? Yes. They did go extinct. They died, yes. But if you were slowly burying a dinosaur, it would decay and rot away, right? It had to be buried quickly. And it had to be buried in a lot of wet mud because you had to soak silica into that bone to turn it into stone. Okay, and silica is what's in mud. So the silica would seep into the bone and turn it into stone. So bury it deep in a lot of wet mud. Next one. All right, so we've got to ask the question, how did dinosaurs get buried in a lot of wet mud? Where did all that mud come from? And you want to jump to the answer, don't you? But that's the question we need to be asking. Go ahead and tell me. Water. Yes, it took a lot of water. Next one. All right, now we're going to leave the dinosaurs. We'll come back to them when it's Brian's turn. So the secular view of Earth's features required millions of years. You go to the Grand Canyon, millions of years for that canyon to be formed by the river. You go to Hawaii, a couple million years for that volcano to build up, and so forth. Next one. We're going to skip the geological column. Next one. I'm sorry, guys. Next one. And Brian, you can skip it too. Next one. All right, because I want to get to Surtsey for the time. Surtsey is an island that was a volcano that started on the bottom of the ocean, and it very quickly blew and formed this island. Fishermen actually watch the volcano go off and see the island grow. Next one. In 2 years, it was covered with grass, flowers, nesting birds. It looked old, and it was only 2 years old. Next one. The beach had lava sand on it, where the waves came up and broke that rock into lava. And look at the rounded boulders. The waves rounded off those boulders in just 2 years. Okay. Next one. Mount St. Helens, another favorite place of mine. I could talk for an hour. I actually do have a presentation. In fact, how many of you have seen in David Reeves the big scaled Mount St. Helens thing? Okay. A few months ago, I'm the one who made that, and it was so much fun doing. So Mount St. Helens is what I love to do. All right, next one. So in one day, it blew its top. 2/3 of the mountain blown away in just a day. Next one. This canyon here was formed not by that little river that you see running through it. Does everybody see that little river? The canyon was formed 2 years after the eruption with a huge amount of water that came rushing over the side. The canyon was formed in one day. Next one. So the volcano blew its top. Winter came, was covered with snow. A small eruption melted all that snow very quickly, and it turned to water. And in a cup like this, you can fill it with snow, but you can't fill it with all the water. The water rushed over the edge and carved the canyon. Next one. But that little arrow is just pointing to the little mouth of the volcano, of the canyon, That whole huge 600-foot canyon is what was carved by one day. Isn't that amazing? And as that water turned it all into mud and kept eating and carving it away, it formed a mud flow that rushed into the valley. Next one, I think, will be a picture of it. Yes. So that mud flow came rushing through the valley and carved this canyon system. Anyone want to have a guess at how long it took? 1 day. Next one. Now you can go hiking down into that canyon system if you have a permit, and you look up at the edge, and what do you see? All those layers. And those layers all formed quickly, not millions of years. Fast-flowing ash and steam will sort it out into sizes and make all of those little layers. For years, this picture Dr. Austin took, and for years I thought this was the size of the canyon. Then I found out later, no, it's not. They had to climb way up on the side. This canyon is extremely deep. That was carved in just one day. Next one. And it might show you, yes. So the circles in red, those are the people who are reenacting that picture that Dr. Austin took. So they had to climb way up the side to get to where the fine layers were. And all of that was carved out in a day. Next one. These are concretions, gigantic concretions. And we can find concretions all over the world. You can find small ones, you can find large ones. These are in South Dakota on top of a mountain. Scientists have no idea what makes concretions. A lot of guesses out there, but no idea. But next one. But when the ash from Mount St. Helens fell into the streams and the eddies swirled it around, it made little concretions. So swirled around in little eddies, that hot ash became little concretions. So imagine what formed the big concretions. Okay, next one. I think it's going to be your turn, Brian. No, it's not. It's still going. All right, secular perspective is coal. And on the back table, I have 2 black rocks. One of them is coal, and one of them is something else. So kids, when you go back there and look, tell me what those 2 are, which is what, right? Everybody, well, anyways, when you see it, most of you should know it. But the coal is what we find with coal and lime rock and coal and lime rock all the way up the side of the hill. And they say that coal comes from a swamp and peat collected in the swamp. And then the land sank and the ocean came in and lime rock was formed. Then the land rose and the swamp came back. And you get some more peat, back and forth, back and forth. Everybody get the picture? But at Mount St. Helens, we had peat form very, very quickly. Next one. During the eruption, a whole lot of trees were washed into Spirit Lake. And these trees were floating about on the water, and the bark rubbed off the trees and sank to the bottom. Dr. Austin actually went scuba diving down there, and he discovered 3 feet of bark waiting to become coal. Now, it's not becoming coal, because guess what it's doing? It's rotting away. To become coal, you have to bury it quick and deep, and a lot of heat and pressure will turn it into coal. Okay? But it collects very quickly, but then you have to bury it. Next one. Hold on just a minute. Okay. Next. All right. This is a petrified tree. This is a sequoia tree in Colorado. Notice it is huge, but it's only the tree trunk. Now, scientists like to say that a sequoia forest grew here. But do you know what's missing? One guess. Raise your hand so I know who's talking. Yeah. Right. They don't live there anymore. They live in in California. But on these stumps, guess what's missing? The root system. There's no roots. So could that be where they grew? No. If that's where they grew, they would all be connected with their root system, and it would be really cool. But instead, they're just broken off stumps that were buried. All right, next one. At Mount St. Helens, guess what Dr. Austin found on the bottom of Spirit Lake? He found trees that were upright. Not because that's where they grew, that's where they sank. And when they sank, when they finally became waterlogged and sank, their roots sank first. A lot of them, not all of them. So some look like that's where they grew. All right, next one. Biblical perspective, your turn.
Okay. Did I turn it off?
They'll do it back there.
Okay, got it. Oh. Hello. Hi, folks. So we're going to shift gears and talk the biblical perspective versus the evolutionary perspective. And in Genesis 7:17 through 24, we're going to read this. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered, and the mountains were covered. That's very important. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven. And Noah only remained alive, and that they were with him in the ark. So that sets the perspective, of course, of that, some 4,500 years ago, we would call Noah's flood. Next slide. So the evidence, of course, that Carla has shared a lot with is examples of the sedimentary layers. You have the coal beds, and which you have the rocks in between that, the sedimentary rock. And so that's a good. And this is something that we find all over the world, except for places like Hawaii, which is all volcanic and all. But for most every part of the world, that's sedimentary layers that you're going to find the several different layers, and some of them, of course, contain coal. So and then coal and lime rock and coal and lime rock. So it's a good perspective there. Next slide. And I know she didn't touch on the geological column, but you probably have seen in the people talk about in textbooks about the geological column, but really a lot of it is, as far as you can't find the geological column anywhere in the world as far as all the distinct layers. In the Grand Canyon's a good example, but we didn't have time to go through that. But where do you find evidence of the geological column? Well, it's just in the books, posters, museums. It's not really in real life as far as in the geological areas of the world. If you could find any of it, would be the Grand Canyon, but we see some of the layers, but not all the layers that the history book or the geological books talk about. So anyway, next slide. So another evidence really that of the worldwide flood is the shale falls, and this is on top of the Bighorn Mountain as you're going into Yellowstone. And I don't know if anyone's ever been to Yellowstone, a few of you, but as you're going into it, you go up to this high mountain. Well, of all things, on top of this mountain is shale falls, and what do we find? Fossilized seashells that are, again, far from the sea. We're talking Yellowstone here, in Wyoming and Montana, and they're completely closed fossilized clams. And so, you know, you've been on the beach and you've seen the open clams. Is because when they die, the mussel releases it and they're just laying there in halves. Well, they didn't have time for that because they were quickly buried, and so and fossilized over a very short period of time. So, of all places, on top of a mountain in Wyoming. Next slide. So yes, the fossils are a record of death and destruction, but was it over millions of years? Well, I would dispute that. We would dispute that, and we would say that it's an example of the worldwide flood. Next slide. In the ark, all were safe and sound, but outside its walls, all else had drowned. The beautiful world that God had made was now a swirling, mud-filled sea, for God could not allow wickedness to be. Next slide. Oh, how he grieved while destroying his creation when splitting asunder its very foundation, watching layer after layer of mud and debris being laid beneath man and beast's watery grave. Oh, if only people would learn to behave. It's not hard to imagine what could have transpired, what thoughts the turbulent sea inspired. While watching the death of those who had strayed, I can almost hear God the Father say, my son, how shall we teach them to obey? And his reply, let's turn these trees to stone and preserve the animal's bone. Then as the waters from land recede, it will channel through the muddy ground, uncovering the fossils so they'll be found. And generations that come and go will have no excuse but to know, for there in the rocks they will clearly read the story of this destructive day. They'll be reminded of their need to learn your will and your will obey. For only by following your instruction will man be saved from utter destruction, as some were on this day. So if you think about that as the worldwide flood is a reminder to us when we see this of God's judgment on who? On mankind, right? Because man was so wicked that God said, enough. But yet we had one righteous family. We don't know how many people were on the earth at that time, but it's tragic that only one family saw grace in God's eyes. And of course, he spared them. And if he didn't, we wouldn't be here today, would we? So that's very important that we look at those rocks, the petrified wood and the bones, the fossilized bones, and etc. This is a reminder to us as believers that there was a cataclysmic flood some 4,500 years ago, and a good reminder to us that we need to obey him. Next slide. But if fossils are from the flood, then were dinosaurs on the ark? And so this is, I remember sitting in a debate one time in San Diego, and two evolutionists versus one creationist, and they just kept saying, oh, the dinosaurs, they're not going to be able to fit into the ark and all of that. Of course, this is way before we had the ark encounter up in Kentucky, northern Kentucky. But there's something very easily solved, isn't it? Because the next slide will show that when, just like crocodiles, alligators, they start off like really small, and then they get bigger, and they get bigger. And so if you've been inside the Ark Encounter, probably you have, a lot of you have, and if you haven't, go see it. You're just in awe of how much space there is. And to think about all of the animals that would have been on there, including the dinosaurs or dragons, as she mentioned. But again, they start out small. No offense, because I'm a grandfather too, but I didn't have to take the grandfathers, right? The big sauropods, the big T-Rexes, all he had to do was to take the small ones, because in hopes that they would, of course, reproduce and that there would be more. So that's something that's very easily solved. Next slide. And the biblical perspective is that God controlled the flood. And Psalms 104 is a great passage. In verse 6 through 9, it says, thou coverest it with the deep, as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. So he's talking about the flood. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up by the mountains. They go down by the valleys unto the place where thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, then that they turn not again to cover the earth. So it's all talking about that the flood, and Psalms, of course, is referring to that. So it's a great piece of Scripture, of course, dealing with other parts of Scripture. So that's important there that we need to keep in mind. Next slide. And then Jeremiah 5:22 talks about God controlling the sea. Fear ye not me, saith the Lord. Will you not tremble at my presence, which have placed the sand for the bound of the sea by a perpetual decree, that it cannot pass it? And though the waves thereof toss themselves, yet can they not prevail. Though they roar, yet can they not pass over it. So God controls the sea, and he sets up the boundaries. And so the world that Noah would have had prior to the flood is totally different than the world that he came in after that year-long flood, and he began to set up his different civilizations that come out of it. So totally different than what some people say. Oh, well, we think we know where Adam and Eve would have lived, the Garden of Eden. No, you don't, because it's gone. It would have been eliminated. It would have been destroyed. I mean, you could kind of say maybe it was the Middle East, but we don't know that for sure. But anyway, that's if you're a theistic evolutionist, that is, you believe that you can blend evolution and creation, or the Bible, then that's the way that they think. But that's not what we see in the fossil records. It's not what we see in the sedimentary layers. It had to be completely, everything had to be completely destroyed and then rebuilt with all the different layers that we have all over the world. Next slide. So the Bible talks about the different seasons. Again, this is something that Noah wouldn't have been familiar with, as far as we know. But after the flood, we have the different seasons that the Scripture verses talk about, like thou hast made summer and winter in Psalm 74:17, and then Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So God creates the seasons. Now, my wife is from Florida, and they have two seasons, spring and summer. But that was different last week. They did actually experience some cold. So it was kind of funny. We were up in Illinois, and sometimes with the wind chill, it was 20 below zero. And so, but we looked at Leesburg, Florida sometimes, and it was like 30 degrees, and like, oh, I bet they're really, really suffering. But anyway, side note. But God created the seasons, and so it would have been a whole different setup than what Noah would have known prior to that, as far as we know. Next slide. In Exodus 20, verse 10 through 11, we have the biblical perspective that God created everything. And this is, Moses is on top of the mountain, and he's receiving the Ten Commandments. So he's chiseled out the tables, and then God himself with his finger is going to write the Ten Commandments. So this is God speaking in Exodus 20, 10 through 11. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and then he rested the seventh day. And so he gave us the 7-day week, didn't he? And so if we want to argue with God that's saying, oh, well, the earth is millions of years old, and even that the 6 days of creation, no, they should really be interpreted to like 6,000 years, or maybe even longer than that. And there are a lot of people who believe that because, again, they're taking the evolutionary perspective of science that we need long periods of time. And so somehow we got to fit the Bible in there with that. But God says, he does make it really clear in Genesis 1 and 2, but he makes it clear, especially clear in Exodus chapter 20, because where do we get the week from? Because you don't find it in astronomy. And we have the lunar calendars, of course, and we know the as far as the moon cycle and the earth going around the sun, and the solar cycles. All that is astronomy, but not with the week. It comes right out of the Bible, and that's acceptable through most civilizations. I'm saying maybe not all civilizations, but most civilizations. So that's important that we remember that and point people back to that, especially if they're a believer, claim to be a believer. Hey, what about Exodus 20? God's speaking here. Next slide. So again, just recapping with the law of biogenesis, it's a proven scientific law, and maybe you go to the store. Of course, you buy a gallon of milk, and it says pasteurized milk and all that. Of course, it all goes back to Louis Pasteur and his experiments of getting the bacteria and sealing it and keeping things from being spoiled. Next slide. We have the biblical perspective that there are distinct kinds. We have, of course, the plants that reproduce after their kind. The birds and fish would reproduce after their kind. The cattle, the beasts, the creeping things, the dinosaurs, of course, included with that, would be reproducing after their kind. And then God created man and woman, and he made us in his image. And we are completely separate from all of the other creations. And when God created Adam, he wasn't instantaneous alive, was he? God created him. He laid there on the ground until what? God did what? Breathed him the breath of life, right? Making humans completely distinct. Yeah, we might share some characteristics of some apes, chimpanzees and gorillas, that type of thing. But we are completely distinct from all of them. And that, of course, is proven all over and over again with just the technology that we have, the intelligence that we have. Next slide. And so here's some observations in science that show that kinds are fixed, but yet they're flexible. But when you look at that, what do you see? There are horses, right? That they may be small, they may be medium, they may be really large, like the Clydesdale, but they're all horses. And so when evolutionists get real excited when they find, we find these ancient horses in the fossil record. But what they're finding is it's still a horse. If it's been millions of years, it should be something that's different. Next slide. And the same way with dogs. And of course, we as humans, we like different kinds of dogs, and so we'll breed them differently for maybe they like the Swiss Alps or something, where they need more of a rescue dog or something. They're gonna. Then some are sheep dogs, and so we have all kinds of ways that we interbreed dogs in order to get a variety, and so that's a great example. But we look at this and we say, well, it's a dog, right? They're dogs. They're not a cat and a dog mix or any other type of a mixture. It's completely easy to see that they're dogs. Next slide. However, since there is a lots of variety within a kind, yet no kind has ever been observed changing into another kind. So would you ever see this on, what would you call it? An Ella bird or something like that? You ever seen something like that in your bird feeder? Yeah. But folks, if evolution were true, we would find things like this we should find millions of these, what we would call a transitional form in the fossil record, but we don't. We've never found any of them. Now they say, we found a few things like skulls and things like that, Peking man and Piltdown man and Nebraska man and all of these. All of them have been proven to be hoaxes, or you can't even find the evidence anymore because it was so wrong that they just kind of glossed it over and moved it out of the way. So, but again, if we had these transitions, they would be millions of them that we would find all the time in the fossil record, but we don't. Next slide. Real quickly, two perspectives of ancient man. We have God creating man, of course, Adam and Eve, and then we have we're evolved from an ape-like ancestor. Next slide. So does caveman equal ape man? Well, if you see on the right side, your right side, you see this is an artist rendition of what they think would have been a mixture of an ape and a man. That is a transition. That is from one to the other. Okay? You follow me? But then on the left, This is more of what they would call Neanderthal man. You've probably heard of Neanderthal man, right? You've probably seen some of the movies that talk about Neanderthal man. But even what you see in the movies, of course, is completely wrong, because these skeletons, they weren't fossilized, but these skeletons were found in Europe from Spain all the way to Russia back in the 1800s. And so scientists were really excited about it first because they thought, oh, we found the missing link. But when they began to really study them, but even without even looking in the cave and what was in the cave, they said, we're beginning to think that maybe they were human. Oh no, and that just like we are, modern humans, and that they were not a transition. So there were several factors that were involved with that, but I'll set that aside. But what they found in the caves was clear evidence that we were dealing with not primitive man, but intelligent man. Why? Because they found these beautiful paintings that they painting on the sides of the walls, and you see a little bit of the pictures up there, like the bison and all. And so they had to be intelligent enough to come up with a combination of using the earth to develop paint in order to put these on the wall. And they found musical instruments that they made out of animal's bone, like flutes and all, that this was something of intelligence. And plus, you love music. I loved hearing you all earlier with the hymns. And they loved music, whoever they were. And they also found that the way that they buried their dead was very lovingly, very ceremoniously. Those are just some of the factors that they realized, hey, this is a really intelligent person that lived here. And now scientists today, secular, Christian, regardless, they say that these were actually, Neanderthal was actually human beings, no different than what we are today. So that is pretty amazing. What they thought was a missing link, but actually is no different than you and I. Next slide. So the secular perspective is that Moses could not write. Oh boy, this is a big one on the evolutionary time frame. And it says it was once thought that writing had not been invented at Moses' time, and so he could not have possibly written the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Pentateuch. But if you love, anyone like archaeology, biblical archaeology, you've studied that some, okay? This is one of those times where archaeology just leaps out and says, the Bible is true. And by the way, any archaeologists, biblical archaeologists digging up in the Middle East, Christian or not Christian, but especially those not Christian, they usually always consult the Bible, or they should consult the Bible first before they do their digging, because it's become proven to be most accurate of anything else. But so, next slide. This proved that writing has been invented for a long time, and it goes. This is the Ebla tablets were discovered in Syria in 1975, and what they uncovered was a library of what we would call cuneiform. And this cuneiform or web-shaped writing goes all the way back to 2300 BC. Well, we know Moses doesn't come around until 1,000 years later. And so here he is writing the Pentateuch, and writing has been around since the beginning. No doubt probably Adam and Eve would have written, because there was records that no doubt that Noah would have taken on board the ark, and maybe some of those would have been with Adam's hand on that. So anyway, so that completely throws that idea out the door. Next slide. So then you have of course the Tower of Babel is a couple of hundred years after the flood. God had given them specific command to reproduce and fill out the world that had been flooded. I want you to just repopulate the world. But they said, I think we would just like to stay in one place and just kind of build our own area. And the guy named Nimrod, of course, who was leading that, it talks about in Genesis 11 or Genesis 10. But God said, okay, well, if you're not going to do it the way I want you to do it, then I will force you to do it. And so he created languages. They were all just one language. Now we have several languages, some 70 different languages or so that come out of the Tower of Babel. And God's going to guide them all in different directions. And next slide should show a panorama here. We have, of course, we talked about the caves up in Europe. So you see in the upper left-hand corner, and you have the pagoda representing Asia, and Stasi Indians. So have you ever heard of them in the southwest of the United States, right in the center there, and then others, of course, representing parts of Africa and Europe. So they all scatter. They develop their civilization with their language, and of course, some of them are going in different areas where God has designated them. They need more pigment in their skin because they're going to be on the equator, and so like Africa, and so their skin needs to be adapted to that. And so then we have what would be Caucasian. A lot of us are Caucasian. That would have been up north, and they would have needed a lighter skin in order because they're not going to have as much sunlight. So God is orchestrating all of this, and I think I have a scripture verse on that. Next slide. Let's see. Yes. God that made the world and all things therein hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So he orchestrated certain people to go this direction, some to get on boats and go over to what would be Central America, South America, even North America, different parts of the world, because they had that technology, right? I mean, Noah had built that ark, and so a lot of the understood being able to maneuver using boats and other types of transportation. So anyway, so God spanned the world out that way. Next slide. So the biblical perspective is that the Bible is inspired word of God, and although it has been copied so many times, God has preserved his word. And so, because some people say, oh, well, you know, he's copied it so many times. It's been copied so many times, so there's got to be a lot of errors in it. But no, that hasn't been the case at all. Next slide. In fact, a great example would be the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anyone ever heard the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay. In Qumran, the southern part of Israel, in 1947, a shepherd boy, this is what they say, legend, we're not absolutely sure, shepherd boy was throwing rocks in some of the caves, and he heard a crash. And so he went to investigate it, and he uncovered inadvertently one of the jars had been broken containing one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we have some, from 1947 to 1956, some 800 scrolls. Some of those are complete copies of Isaiah, complete copies of Psalms and Deuteronomy and several others. And others, we have just fragments of the different, because we're just talking Old Testament, not New Testament, except for Esther. Probably because maybe that was in Aramaic or something, and so they didn't translate it well. But for the most part. Now, you find other things too, but those are the big things that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that was, interestingly and timely, that in 1948, what happened in 1948 in Israel? Independence, right. They became a country again after being exiled for so many years. And so God allowed that perfect time for them to be found and preserved. And you find them in the different museums, especially in Israel and other parts, and as a testimony. And when you examine those, next slide. So when you examine the Dead Sea Scrolls compared to what we have today, guess what? No changes. So these were really, really well preserved. And there's a whole story behind that as far as how they were preserved. We don't have time for that, but it's amazing. Unchanged. Next slide. So real quickly, the biblical perspective of Earth's history, we had God created a perfect world or utopia. Next slide. Adam and Eve disobeyed God and he followed Satan. Next slide. God had to curse the world, but he offered redemption to man. So we see that flow of history here. Next slide. And then animals, sacrifices were a picture of Christ, and that was right at the beginning. That whatever the instructions were, that Adam and Eve passed down to their sons, and then on down as far as the sacrificing of a lamb or whatever it was. And then 2,000 years later, man's wickedness brought God's judgment. We know that as the worldwide flood or Noah's flood because man's wickedness was so bad. Next slide. And then God came to earth. He died on the cross to pay the price of man's sin. and he rose again on the third day. And I think that's the last one, isn't it? Oh, and then one day, of course, mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 3, God is going to destroy the earth again, but not by water. And by the way, what's a sign that we have in the heavens that says that God will never flood the world again? A rainbow. Now, if you're a theistic evolutionist, you believe that it was a local flood and it wasn't a worldwide flood, but then they have a problem when it comes to the rainbow, because God says, I'm going to put my bow in the sky. That's going to be a covenant between God and us that he will never flood the world again. So are you saying that God is a liar every time that there's a flash flood? You know, think about the people in North Carolina, right? I'm assuming, were you all affected by the hurricane with the rain, all that? Okay. So I guess mainly Western North Carolina and maybe East Tennessee, right? East Tennessee. So ask them. You know, they were affected. Towns were wiped out. Homes were destroyed. People's lives were lost. So tragic. But yet we have the rainbow because God's saying it's a worldwide flood, not a local flood. And so 2 Peter says, hey, are you ready for the next judgment upon this earth? We don't know when it's going to take place, but God is going to destroy the world by fire, some type of fire. We don't know what that is, but that's going to happen in the future. Could be soon, as far as after we go through the tribulation and all that. But are those who are left behind? I believe that those of us as believers will be with God, but different interpretations. But anyway, that's a coming judgment in 2 Peter 3. That's tragic for those people who are left on this earth. And with that, I'm going to pray. And do I turn it back over to you, Clint, or someone? Or I'll just go ahead and pray, and then we'll see what happens, okay? And don't forget about I know it's a little bit past 7:30. I'm sorry about that. But please feel free to go back there and check out what we have. And if you have any questions, we'll try to answer them. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you that both young and old were very attentive. I pray that it's been an encouragement to them, and I pray that you would continue to watch over them and give them wisdom as they rub shoulders with those who don't know you, that maybe they can plant a seed of truth in their hearts that you are God and that you love them and you gave your life for them, Lord Jesus. And we thank you and we praise you. We ask these things in your wonderful name. Amen. All right.
All right. So wasn't that an awesome presentation? Yeah.